Great. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So hello, everybody. My name is Kelly Shuster, and this is the talk on the Android support library. So hope you're in the right spot. So I just want to talk a little bit about the picture that I chose for my title slide. So the Android support libraries let you sort of bridge and backport your current, the current latest operating system feature set back to older older devices. So I always like to think of the support libraries as a bridge, so that's why I chose this. But this specific bridge is kind of special. It's actually in Colorado. It's about 2 hours south of here in a place called Canyon City. And this is the Royal Gorge Bridge that goes over the Arkansas River. And it used to be the tallest bridge in the world until 2001. It's 955 feet above the Arkansas River. And it was built in 1929. So I am a Colorado native, and so I'm very proud of Colorado and the fact that this conference is here. So I just wanted to share a little Colorado trivia with you all. So I work at a company called Ibotta. We're located in Denver, just a couple blocks from here. And I'm on their Android team. And I just wanted to let you all know, if you don't know and you don't use Ibotta, we have a rebate in our app right now for Uber. So we're a cashback on lots of different stores and now mobile apps as well. So you get $1 back cash if you open Uber through Ibotta, and they're running a bonus this week that you get $5 bonus for taking an Uber ride. So that's $6 back. So I'm a huge money saver person, so if you're taking Uber while you're at the conference, make sure you check out Ibotta. All right, so I think, especially when we take a look at Wen's talk that she just gave, a lot of time that we spend with Android development is spent looking forward and anxiously looking at the next thing. But I think that it's kind of fun to just take a look back and see how far we've come, because a lot has happened in the Android ecosystem over the past few years. So just a quick history about the Android support libraries and where we've gone. So in the year 2011, the first support libraries were released, and they were called the V4 support library and the V13 support library. And this was really exciting to have the ability to backport some features to your older operating systems. Now in 2012, while Google was still releasing updates to their support libraries, a big library was released not by Google, but that a lot of people felt like was a support library, and this was called ActionBar Sherlock. So there was a time and place in the world, it's hard to believe now, that the action bar was not a thing in Android apps. And Google didn't support it in their support library. So this was a third-party library written by Jake Wharton that allowed you to backport the action bar to your older operating systems. Then in 2013, we got a whole nother slew of libraries. The V7 AppCompat library was really exciting because that actually gave you support for the action bar, so people didn't need to pull in this third-party dependency anymore. 2014, another big year. As they continued to update the support libraries, they also released new ones, one for CardView, RecyclerView, the Palette library, the Leanback library, and the Where library. In 2015, this was a huge year. They released annotations, design support library, custom tabs, percent, the app recommendation support, and preference support libraries for various versions. And then finally in 2016, again, more libraries released. So the vector-drawable support library, which is one of my favorites. Then they split up the V4 library into different components, and then the EXIF interface support library was released. And this year, we've got the dynamic animation library and the emoji compat library. So when people talk about the Android support library, sometimes they just say it singularly, like the library, but there's a whole lot of support libraries. And it's a good thing that they've broken these out into different components, because if you had to conclude one library, that would be a hell of a lot of code that you're pulling into your app that you don't really need. So I didn't even actually realize that there were this many libraries until I started researching for this talk. All right, so just a few general tips and tricks when you're working with the support libraries. So the naming is kind of weird and confusing. So what does this mean when you pull in a support library? So this back number, it references the API version that your support library has been built against. So if you're targeting an API 25, you want to pull in the support libraries that are version 25 dot something. And then the next two numbers, the 1.0 here, those reference the actual version of the support library itself. So that's what that means. This V7 is kind of like a legacy thing. So in the beginning, V7 used to mean that everything in this support library can be used all the way back to API 7. So any method you call here will work for operating systems all the way down to API 7. Well, that's no longer the case, because as Android has progressed and more operating systems have been released, people are finally getting off of these old operating systems on their devices. So we don't need to support all the way back to v7 and pull in all that code with the library. So Google has slowly been increasing the number or the level of APIs that these libraries support back to. So now you can't rely on the name itself of the library to know how far back it supports. So you have to check the documentation. So I tend to pull in a lot of different support libraries, and it's kind of annoying when the support library gets updated that I have to consistently change the version number in every single one of the libraries. So something that I do in my Gradle script, in the build script, lib version, I define what version I want to use, and then I can just substitute that in for all the libraries. So that's handy. I only have to change that one place. Also, something that's important to know is that you have to use a support library version that matches with your target API. So here I'm getting an error in my build file because I'm trying to use the 25 version libraries, but I'm targeting API 26, so just know that. Also, sometimes it can get confusing when you're pulling in a lot of different libraries that, third-party libraries might reference the support libraries, or you might have different parts of your app, different modules that are referencing different libraries. And sometimes you can get an error because you're trying to pull in one version of the support library in this part of your code and another version in this part of your code. So one thing I like to run is this dependencies script. So Gradle-q dependencies app:\dependencies. Where app is the name of your app module. Here it's highlighted. That's the default name. And this will give you a rundown of all the dependencies. If you're using the 25.plus versioning system, that first line up there, this command will also tell you what actual version that got resolved to. And then you can see all the different versions that you're pulling in and figure out where that mismatch is happening. Another thing is that you need to be aware of stubbed methods. So when you pull in the support library and it says, oh, this is the support library, and it goes all the way back to X operating system, you assume that when you call a method, well, it would be supported back to X operating system, because what the heck is the point of the support library if it doesn't do that? Well, unfortunately, not all of the methods actually work. So it's important to check on older APIs that your app is doing what you assumed it was doing. So here's an example. ViewCompat set elevation on a text view. And I'm calling a ViewCompat method to set the elevation, and I'm assuming that that would work. But unfortunately, this doesn't actually work on pre-Lollipop devices. There's no lint warning. There's no compile error. It just doesn't work. So when you're using the support library, always make sure that you're testing your app on the lowest operating system that you want to support to make sure that you don't have any of these hidden stubbed methods that are just doing nothing. All right, a few popular components of the support library. I'm going to run through some of the big ones that I enjoy using and give you a little bit of an overview of just quickly how to pop them into your code. So a really famous one is ViewPager. You get this in the v7 library, but it's actually defined in the v4 library, but the v7 library includes the v4 library. So yeah, kind of confusing. So you don't need to include the v4 library, but that's where it's really coming from. So the ViewPager is this component here that allows you to have sort of this giant horizontal list of stuff, and you can swipe back and forth. So it's pretty simple. See, when you pull it in, it says the v4 support library. So you just pull it in your layout where you want it to exist. And then you'll want to create a pager adapter, which is what links your data to this ViewPager element. So here I've defined my custom pager adapter. And then you just link up your adapter to the ViewPager by just ViewPager.setAdapter. That's pretty simple. So this one is in the design library, and it's the TabLayout. So that's this piece up at the top. So a few years ago, Google released a bunch of sample code for how to do this. And then every few months, they'd update the sample code. And every time I was using a new project, I have to go in and delete the old files and pull in the new files and be oh, now this thing works different. Anyway, it was a huge pain. So now they've actually just released it as part of their design support library, so you don't have to do that. So if you were using this in an old project, make sure you update this to just pull in from the design support library, because it's a lot nicer interface now. So basically, I just pop in the TabLayout widget in my XML file where I want to use it. And then in my custom pager adapter from the view pager, then I can set the page title to whatever I want. So here I'm just setting like title number, whatever. And then in your Java file, you hook up your tab layout with your view pager by calling tablayout.setup with view pager. And that's it. So this works really, really nice with view pager. It's super easy. All right, so the toolbar, this is in AppCompat v7. This is another popular one. So back in the day, the action bar used to just be like for a title and an icon and an overflow menu, but now the toolbar gives you a lot of freedom as to what you want to put up there. So here's an example from our app where we are doing a lot of different things up there. So first thing you want to do is set the theme for your app to no action bar, because you don't want it to default and put the default action bar up there, because you're going to be putting your own. And then you define your toolbar in your layout file. And the toolbar is basically like a layout, and then you can put anything you want inside of the toolbar layout. So here I've got an image view and a text view and stuff like that. Then, really important, you need to call setActionBar or setSupportActionBar with the toolbar, because the toolbar is just a layout, and so the system doesn't really know that you want it to behave as the action bar. So you have to set the action bar. I think there's like a lot of confusion because people like to talk about like the toolbar is the new action bar, and kind of, but not really. Like the toolbar is just a layout, and you can make it act as the action bar. All right, CoordinatorLayout. This one I love. This is really fun to play with because it's only a few lines of code, and it makes your app look very magical. So this is an example of CoordinatorLayout. You can see the toolbar gets hidden as I scroll up and down, and it comes back. So basically, CoordinatorLayout allows its direct children to do magical things, and you have to use the direct children of CoordinatorLayout. You can't like nest things and expect them to know about CoordinatorLayout. So make sure everything you want to be moving around is a direct child of CoordinatorLayout. So first thing here, we've got our toolbar in the app bar layout, and then we've got our main content in a nested scroll view. And then in the app bar layout, we've got a collapsing toolbar layout, and then ultimately we have finally our toolbar. So in our collapsing toolbar layout, we want to set this flag. So we want the toolbar to scroll and enter always. So when you pull it down, it'll always pop back up. And then in the nested scroll view, we set the app layout behavior. And this is defined as a string, but I don't have to define that string myself. It's already defined for me. And that's all it is. The floating action button and the snack bar are two pieces from the design support library that act really well together. And they're some core pieces of the material design, design language. So here's an example. You click the button in the lower right-hand corner, and then the snack bar pops up. So pretty easy. The floating action button is just basically like a regular button that's circular and has an elevation set on it. So it doesn't automatically go in the bottom right corner of your screen. You need to set that on your own. And then you just set the view like you normally do, and then set an on-click listener just like a regular button. This is a pretty simple way to create a snack bar, which is the bottom one that pops up. And there are different ways you can do it. You can add buttons in the snack bar, but this is a very straightforward way. Just snackbar.make, and make sure you call the .show method or it won't show. So one thing that's cool about this is see how the floating action button like moves up with the snack bar. So that is actually something you can get by default if you use the coordinator layout. And that's the recommended way to do this. You don't want to actually have that go over your button. So you just want to make sure that your floating action button is a direct descendant of a coordinator layout, and then this will happen automatically for you. Another one that I really love to use is the text input layout in the design library. So this allows you to have that hint in your edit text box, and then it like swoops up to become the title when you type. It also gives you some really awesome styling capabilities for those error messages if you're typing the wrong thing. So basically you have a text input layout as your main wrapper, and then you put an edit text inside. This can kind of get ugly in your code if you have like a long form submission, because every edit text box is going to now require 2 layouts. So that's kind of annoying to look at that file. But that's what you do. Also, there's kind of some elaborate styling stuff that goes on here. So you want to style the text input layout. It has its own style. Then to style the error color that comes up, you have to style the error text appearance on as like a theme on the text input layout. And then finally, you can set the regular edit text style in your text input edit text. So since we're running a little bit short on time, I'm going to run through this, but I'll post my slides later so that you can take a look at this code. So here's the 3 different things that you need to style the whole kit and caboodle. Also, one thing to note, when I have a valid input state, I set the error to null, and I also disable the error. And then when I have an error state, I set the error enabled to be true, and then I set the error text. So you might wonder, like, why don't we just set the error always to be enabled, because that's what allows us to show the error state. Why are we constantly turning it on and off? Well, it turns on, if you keep the error state enabled, you end up with this giant space at the bottom of your text view, or your edit text, because it is like leaving space for that error to always appear, which I find annoying. So if you continually enable and disable the error, that'll like shrink down if the error's not showing. Also, it's important to use the text input edit text inside your text input layout and not just a regular edit text, and this is why. Because you're setting the hint to be like a normal hint, and then it swoops up to be the title. Well, if somebody is going to type in horizontal mode so that they won't see this title anymore, this is what they see if you're using an edit text. So they lose that hint. But if you're using the text input edit text, this is what they'll see. So it's kind of a pain, but that's the only difference between those two. So just remember that it's better to use the text input edit text. Oh, that's hard to say. OK. All right, so this is in the %support library. This is a pretty small library, and it was released with not a lot of fanfare, so a lot of people don't know about it, but it's one of my favorites. It's the %relative layout. So when you're working in a linear layout, you have the option of weights, which I like to think of as percentages. So you say, like, I wanted this to take up 50% of the screen and this to take up 20% of the screen. You can do that with linear layout. But sometimes when you're working in a relative layout, you work yourself into this spot where you're really just like, ugh, if I could only just use like a weight in a relative layout. Well, that's what the %relative layout allows you to do. So you just define your layouts like normal. And then you use app layout height % or layout width % to define a percentage for your layout. And you can mix and match. So you can do like the height is a % and the width is like a DP or wrap content or whatever. So make sure you don't define width and height like normal. Sometimes you get an error in Android Studio, but that's fine. There's no problem. It'll actually still compile. It just shows you the red squigglies. So this is one of my favorite libraries, and unfortunately, it's going away. So that's really sad. But I wanted to mention it in case you guys wanted to use it for the brief moment that it's still available. It's going away because they want you to use constraint layout instead. So constraint layout is the new layout tool, which is really awesome and powerful because it lets you have sort of the idea of a linear layout where things are placed relative to, or a relative layout where things are placed relative to each other, but there's not any nesting. So it would basically be like one main root element, and then everything in your view would be placed relative to each other. So I'm not going to go into it like super deep because it's like really intense, but Wen has a great talk, Cool Constraint Layout, so be sure to look that up on YouTube and watch that. But basically, you're editing these different constraints of how views interact with each other. And then it kind of auto-generates some XML code for you. But there's a lot more to it, so please look up some information on that before you start using it. So one of my favorite ones is the support-vector-drawable library, and this allows graphic supports for older operating systems. So just like a quick lowdown on the vector stuff, because it's kind of confusing. There is a format called SVG, which is a scalable vector graphic, which allows you to have really crisp images. And the way they do this is instead of storing like in a PNG or a bitmap, it's like literally a mapping of like this pixel's this color, this pixel's this color. And SVG is like, here is the instructions for how to draw this thing. And so every time you show the image, it gets drawn at that moment. And so you can blow it up huge and shrink it down small, and the quality of the image isn't degraded because it's literally being drawn every time. So that's a scalable vector graphic. Android Studio, or Android, supports vector drawable, which is like their own version of an SVG. And it's important to know that they're not a one-to-one relation. So the vector drawable supports a subset of the commands of SVG. So that is important to know when you're talking with your designers, because sometimes they might create a graphic for you and it's an SVG, but it's not completely supported by the vector drawable in Android. So to get an SVG imported into vector drawable, right-click on drawable and then say New Vector Asset. And it goes through Android Studio, this vector asset thing. It will convert your SVG into the vector drawable. And this is what you end up with. Just pro tip, it's kind of nice because when you want a press state for your image, you don't have to ask your designer for a second one. You just copy this whole file and change the fill color, and now you got press states for your vector drawables. So if you want to use this in your library or in your app, you need to set default config vector drawables. Oops. First you import the library, and then vector drawables.use support library true. And this is to support vector drawables for pre-Lollipop devices. And then in your image view, you want to pull in an app:source compat drawable. Do not pull in the Android:source like usual image views. If you're pulling in a vector drawable with Java code, you'll want to call app:compat_resources.getDrawable. This is really important to note. If you don't pull in the vector support library and you reference Android:source drawable and you run this on API 16, you might think that everything's fine because the drawable actually shows up in your app, which is awesome. So like, oh, why do I even need the support library? Well, what happens is at build time, Android Studio is smart, and it says, oh, I see that she's supporting API 16, but she's pulling into vector drawable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, on the fly, create a PNG from the vector code and put that in the app. So even though you see your image in your app, it's going to look really blurry. So here's what it looks like when I've blown it up really big, and here's what it's supposed to look like. So you can see how much that works. So for quite a while, embarrassingly, I was like, oh, apparently you don't need the vector support library. And then I finally blew it up one day, and I was like, oh, that looks terrible. It's so blurry. So there's no error, and so just make sure that you're setting up that correctly. OK. So a little bit about like the last 6-month-ish of support libraries. So from 25.0.0 to the most recent one, 25.3.1. These are the support libraries that can work with the most recent released operating system, API 25. So one thing that was added, which is exciting in support v7, is array set. So this was launched, I think, in Marshmallow, and it was really cool, but it's like, who's going to use a data structure that's not able to be used in like any of the old operating systems? Well, now it's in the support library, so everyone should use it. Array set is available as of 25.1.0. It's more efficient than a traditional hash set. And it's similar to array map, but it contains only 1 item per entry, with array map contains 2 items per entry. So it's like a combo child of hash set and array map. So it's a little bit slower than hash set, so it's not for large items. And according to Google, large items is several more than hundreds of items. So I don't know how large is large according to them, but this is like the guideline. So hundreds of items, you should be OK, is what they say. But I mean, surely run diagnostics on your own app to make sure. And one thing that's cool about this is that it shrinks as items are removed. And so this is what makes it more memory efficient. So it's a little bit slower, but it's more memory efficient, which is really great for, of course, Android with our limited memory that we have. And one thing that they wanted to call out in the docs is that you currently don't have control over the shrinking. So you need to not do anything that would like make assumptions about how and when your data structure is going to be shrunk. They alluded that you may have this ability in the future, but you don't for now. So of course, just make sure that you're pulling in the v4 support array set. And again, you include the v7 library, and you get it because v7 includes v4 for you. The bottom navigation view is a new design pattern in Android, and this is kind of like controversial because for a really long time, Android was like, no bottom navigation views ever because that's an iOS pattern, and then now they're like, bottom navigation is cool. So So there's that. I think, I mean, personally, my own like personal theory is that just phones are getting so big that it's really hard to like one-handed like get the navigation menu and slide it over. But if you have a bottom navigation menu, it's a lot easier with your thumb to just click on items. So I think that's probably why they chose to support it. When it was first launched, there wasn't a lot of information about like, what does this mean with the back button and like, how do I do this navigation pattern? So there is a lot of documentation now, which I'll link to at the end of the slides to help you understand how this navigation pattern works. So basically, this is the bottom navigation menu. You click the buttons and you navigate to different screens. Here I'm just loading different Android guys. And you can see how as I click the item, it changes color and it like animates up a little bit. You get all of this for free when you're using the bottom navigation view. So super easy. You just pull in the bottom navigation view into your XML file. And then you want to set the menu on your bottom navigation view. So you just say app menu, and then you link to your XML file that pulls in your items. Then in your menu XML, you just define all your items, just like you would for like the overflow menu. You give it an ID, a title, and an icon. And then that's all you have to do for your menu XML. And then in your Java code, you just set it up like a regular view, and then you set on navigation item selected listener to listen to the menu items. So you don't like override the overflow menu or any of that stuff. You just set it right here in like on create or wherever you want to set it. And then in your on navigation item selected, you go through each of the item IDs and like load up your screen, or here I'm just changing my drawable based on which action you've clicked. And again, we actually recently updated the UI of our app to include the bottom navigation view, and I was really impressed at the depth of the guideline documentations to explain like how this bottom navigation should work. I hadn't looked at these docs for like probably like 6 months or something, and I was like really impressed with how well they explained how this is supposed to work. So definitely check those out if you haven't in a while. All right, so last and of course not least, what is new in support 26? So this isn't like everything that's new. There's a whole lot of other stuff, but these are just my favorite parts. So first off, it's important to note that the support libraries, starting with 26.0 whatever releases, are only going to support back to API 14, which is ice cream sandwich, which is awesome, unless of course you're supporting an older version with your app. They were able to remove about 1.4K methods to remove support from the older operating system, so that's awesome. They did note that the older support library releases, 25 dot whatevers, are going to continue to support the older operating systems. So if you need to support Gingerbread and Honeycomb, don't worry, you can still continue to use those old libraries to have that support. Another cool thing is Maven support. So you used to have to like download the support libraries through Android Studio, which always felt weird. And now you can just pull them in like any other library you're pulling in. So in your, not your app level, but like the project level build.gradle file, in your all projects repositories tasks, you want to define a new one, which is Maven, and then explicitly define the URL for Google's Maven. And then you can just pull in your library just like regular. Exciting stuff, fonts support. Oh my gosh, I've been waiting for this for like a million years. So before, when you wanted to support fonts, you'd have to put your font in your assets folder, then create a special typeface that referenced that font, and then the most annoying part of all is you had to, every text view that you use had to be this special text view that used the font. So you couldn't just use a normal text view in your XMLs. It was super annoying. But now fonts work like we all thought they should have worked from the beginning. Yay! So first thing is you just drop your TTF file into a res/font directory, which is awesome. One thing that is super cool, and this is only in the Android Studio 3.0.0 whatever release, so that's the Canary version. You can open up the TTF file, and it gives you this cool like window into what the font actually looks like. And my favorite part is you can actually type in this. It's not just like a standard lorem ipsum. You can also type your own stuff to see what it looks like. So that's just like a nice little touch. To pull the font family in, then, what you have to do is just in your text view, just define font family and then @font and the name of your font. That's all you have to do. It's amazing. If you want to set the font in Java, then you want to call resources_compat.getFont and then r.font. The name of your font. If you want to have your font defined in a style, which is a great way to do it because then you don't have to set it on every text view, you need to define a font family. So in your XML font folder, you'll define a font family, which is the name of the font, the style of the font, and the font weight. And then in your style, you can set a custom style and then put the font family in there and then any other stylistic things you want for your text view. And then instead of defining the font on your text view, you can just define the style and then I'll have everything that you need. Another thing that's really exciting is auto-scaling text view. So before, you used to have, like if you pulled your layout and made your text view layout big, it didn't matter, your text size would always be the same. But now we've got auto-scaling text view, which is great. So first you want to set the max and min size of how big and small you want to allow your font to get, or your text view. And then you can also optionally set the granularity. So this is at 2 SP, so that means that every time that your font is scaled, it'll scale by 2, so 12, 14, 16, whatever. And then the scale type should be uniform because you want it to stretch uniformly as your layout stretches. And then I've set the layout heights for these two different text views. One's at 100 dp and one's at 10 dp, so you can see how it changes. So note that the layout height 10 dp has been set, but the min size is 12 SP, so that'll be cut off. So you need to make sure that when you set your minimum and maximum heights, your minimum and maximum text sizes correspond. So this is what they look like. So that's awesome. So if you want your text to scale, then you can have that scale. Also, just note with the new Canary build and the new beta build of all of this stuff, everything's not worked out yet. So I got a bunch of squiggle errors in Android Studio, but it didn't matter. It let me build this just fine. So. And then the grand finale, my most favorite part of API 26 support library is findViewById has a great change. So now all instances of findViewById method now return a view type which extends view instead of just view. So that means we don't have to cast every single call to find view by ID anymore. So that is awesome. So this was like a big change for the team to make, but I'm really glad that they made it because it's going to make our code a lot more clean to read. Yay! All right, so that is all I have for you. This is my overview of the support libraries. I'll be posting these slides via my Twitter, which is @KellyShuster. And at the end of this slide, I have a list of resources, cool blog posts, videos that you can check out, documentation links, everything to give you sort of like a deeper dive to all of these components. So thank you so much for coming to my talk, and I'll be hanging out around a little bit afterwards if you have any questions.